All right, so there's the file. I just sent you the participant manual, so you can take a look at that in the chat. You can download that and walk through with us today all of the material that we have. As people walk in and as people come in, I'm also going to lock the meeting at a certain point, which is going to, only allow a certain number of folks to come in. All right, I've got that. As I said before, this is the third one in our webinar series. So our first two webinars really focused on the navigation of, they really focused on the navigation of this idea of workplace incivility. We really looked at that. We also really looked at and we really engaged around the space of figuring out how to navigate conflict effectively. Now, navigating conflict effectively, obviously, in a remote environment is a little bit different than navigating it in an in-person environment. And that, of course, creates all kinds of different problems, as does navigating incivility and issues of incivility in the workplace. And so navigating incivility is one of those things that we know is something that we have to navigate, but we also kind of have trouble doing it. And so we gave some really robust tips there. This being our third series is about managing change. Thinking about adaptability in particularly tough times. Now, as we live in a post-COVID environment, I was actually just the last meeting that I was on before this with my team was really focused on, what do we do if the power grid goes down? Or what do we do if the internet goes out? Or what do we do if the server that provides us Zoom access goes out? Like Zoom went down on Monday and people kind of freaked out a little bit, right? What do we do if there's a cyber attack? What do we do if there's a mass cyber attack, something that we have no control over, another force majeure type event? How do we continue to deliver services and products and skill sets to clients so that people can lead? What does that look like? How do we stress test a business? How do we stress test an organization? Well, managing change and engaging in adaptability in tough times is really, really important for us to understand not only the stress testing, but also understanding how all these things work together in relation to a number of different areas, which we are going to talk about today. So, change is tough, and leaders navigate it in different ways. And primarily, leaders must have the skill sets of courage, and they must have the skill sets of, of forward thinking, of an appropriate mindset in order to be able to think around corners and bring back what some folks might think of as scary ideas back to their team. Mindsets is the things that can wreck a change management posture, or it can build it up. And if people's mindsets aren't right, it doesn't matter what your strategy is, and it really doesn't matter what your tactics are. I've seen many areas of change management fail because leaders fail to consider the fact that, well, if people's mindsets and hearts aren't aligned with whatever the change management strategy is, well, then it's not going to happen. When things occur that are force majeure events, when things occur that are black swan events, things that are absolutely out of our control, things that we cannot control. For instance, right now in Houston, Galveston, the Gulf of Mexico area at the time of this recording, there is a hurricane going on. Actually, it's two hurricanes that have merged into one. It's 2020. Why not? Merge two hurricanes together and it's swinging, up the coast. It's going through New Orleans and Houston and Galveston, and it's going to impact the southeastern portions of the United States and a good chunk of Texas and Alabama and Tennessee and Kentucky. And who has control over that? Who determines who gets hit and who gets spared? When a tornado comes through Tornado Alley, how does that tornado decide that Bradley's house goes away, but Bob's doesn't? Or Nicole's house gets the roof blown off, but Bradley's house, Bradley only lost like maybe a couple of trees in his front yard. Those are force majeure. Those are black swan events. And black swan events are events that share a number of things in common, and we're going to talk about what those things in common are. But fundamentally, these are events that we can plan for. We can understand if we understand a couple of things about randomness, and we understand a couple of things about volatility, if we understand a couple of things about uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. V.U.C.A in essence. And once we combine those things together, then we can begin to build the only kinds of structures that I can imagine as a leader that will help us get out of these situations. Those are anti-fragile structures, not robust structures, which most of us live under the delusion of robustness, not fragile structures, but anti-fragile structures. And we're going to talk about how to build those structures, how to navigate those in a practical way today. Okay. As usual, I do ask that if you have any questions for me, you want to participate, please, jump right on in. If there's any troubleshooting, if there's any issues with Zoom, if there's any issues with the meeting, if there's any issues with the internet, if I were to suddenly disappear like this, there's a couple of different options you may want to consider. Number one, the men in black probably have got me, so the webinar is over anyway. If they haven't come and got me, then Bob Murphy has probably started singing, so you might want to watch out for that too. Okay.
Oh, Danny boy.
And there we go. And there I go. No. All right. All right. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit. And as usual, just as usual, we have in all of our webinars, we will be, of course, having commercial breaks so that I can go ahead and, get a glass of water, get something to drink. I've been talking for the last 5 hours straight today, which is great. But be having some commercial breaks. We'll be talking about our products and our services here at Human Services Consulting and Training, and really engaging with you around those spaces. Okay, so let's get to some meat, right? Let's get to some fun stuff. So what is the impact of change? Why is change so problematic? What is the impact of disruption and black swans? And by the way, this is something where I really want to engage with you around this, because these are areas that really cause us to sometimes panic, right? And so I'm going to type up some things here. Actually, I'm going to type up this question: what is? And I'd like to get some answers from this that I can riff off of a little bit. But what is the impact of black swans and disruption? Now, again, if you don't know the term black swan, don't worry about it. Just know it's basically disruption that seems random but really isn't. And black swan events usually occur as disruptive events, right? They occur as events that we can't predict, at least not initially, because we only tend to look at things that are directly in front of us. And they lead to, inevitably, disruption and change. So what is the impact of black swan events and disruption? So I put that question right there in the chat for you. I want you to think about that and give me some answers on that as I go through and talk a little bit about sort of what is their impact and why they are important and why we should consider them. So a couple of different things. As the world has become more interconnected, disruption has become more likely, not less. This is a reality that we face as the internet, which giveth, so the internet giveth, and the internet also taketh away. As our systems have become more interconnected, and I think about the example of Netflix. Netflix is a really interesting example. As a company, Netflix grew its market share on the backs of Amazon Web Services and Amazon servers. And Netflix was literally competing with Amazon to provide a content service utilizing the servers of Amazon, until Netflix got to be big enough with a big enough market cap to disconnect from Amazon and to go off and build its own servers. And that's a small example at a business strategy level of how interconnectedness can lead to disruption. So if for some reason Amazon servers go down, then Netflix's service goes down. By the way, so do a whole bunch of other websites and a whole bunch of other businesses like Shopify and Airbnb and Uber and some other parts of Google. But like these are areas that indicate our interconnectedness, and the internet has allowed us to join together at a business at a structural level tighter and tighter and tighter. As a matter of fact, we get really, really mad when things aren't interconnected. After 25 years, 30 years of the internet now, we get really irritated when we have one piece of an archaic system. In a non-political way, let's talk about voting in elections. Voting in elections are the ultimate sort of undisruptible, in the internet era anyway, system. because everything's disconnected. We have voting machines that are from the 1970s. There's mail-in voting, there's absentee voting, there's all these systems, and they're not connected to each other. There's no one centralized voting system. And as you can see in conversations, forget the nature of the election for just a minute, but in conversations around elections, you can see the hue and cry from people who are used to having the ease and of access of interconnected systems, asking that this old archaic system, actually not even asking, demanding that this old archaic system become more deeply interconnected. Well, when you interconnect systems, here's something leaders have to understand. The more interconnectedness you get, the higher a chance you're going to have of disruption. And the bigger a chance that that disruption is going to cause knock-on, you can write that down, knock-on or domino effects down the line. We saw this just right now with COVID. Someone in China sneezed and a supply chain got shut down in Dubuque, Iowa, because we are interconnected. We demand it because of ease and of service, but when a problem occurs, then the disruption is massive and system-wide. That's the first key takeaway. Number two, the impact of black swans is more damaging when delusions of stability are encouraged. Look, I don't know any other way to put this, but what COVID-19 has done is it has exposed how fragile our interconnected systems are. And if systems are, as they get more interconnected, as they become more fragile, as systems begin to increase and they begin to go to scale, as they become more fragile, what winds up happening is the likelihood that one unexpected event can disrupt the whole system not only increases, but it becomes more damaging. And here's the thing, then people become deluded, and leaders have to watch out for this, become deluded in thinking that the problem was, well, our systems just weren't interconnected enough. Our systems just weren't robust enough. And this is what Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the guy who wrote the book Black Swan or Fooled by Randomness, and you can go check him out on fooledbyrandomness.com, interesting website. Not done in a traditional fashion, by the way, really hard to navigate. It actually really walks through his philosophy on this idea that everything shouldn't be interconnected, that in essence, things should be more disconnected, things should be more separated, things should be less centralized, right? Because when there is a delusion of robustness, when a system is really fragile, that causes leaders, teams, organizations, and people to make the same mistakes that led to the disruption in the first place. Mistakes in thinking, mistakes in contingency planning, mistakes in understanding volatility, mistakes. And then, of course, the third thing that we have to think about is resistance. No one ever wants to talk about this, but we really should. Resistance to change is built into our bodies, it's built into our social systems, and it's even built into our teams and our organizations, and yet no one ever wants to talk about resistance out loud. No one wants to talk about how hard it is to get people to shift. Part of the reason why the shift to remote work during a time of COVID was so quick was because the fear of getting a disease was stronger than the fear of going remote. Let me repeat this for all of the humanities students in the back. The fear, and I'm not knocking the humanities, I went to the humanities, I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying the liberal arts students, pay attention to this is important. The fear of getting the disease was bigger than the fear of working from your garage. And the bigger fear won. That's why the speed was so quick to remote. As that fear diminishes, though, now I'm safe. I'm in my house. I'm socially distanced. I'm masked. I'm safe in my house. As that fear diminishes, then other fears begin to rise and get bigger. And now you're seeing a shift happening where you're seeing supervisors, managers, leaders talk about, well, I can't micromanage my people at home. Are they really doing everything they're supposed to be doing? And now this other fear is going up. It's the fear of not being in control that's actually increasing. Resistance to change, right, is built into our bodies. It's built into our social systems. It's so deeply embedded in us, we take it for granted. We don't even think about resistance. Leaders, however, don't have that luxury. Leaders need to think about resistance to change. And by the way, they need to plan for it, particularly in times of volatility, in times of uncertainty. in times where there is no easy answer, where there is complexity, and in times where the answers are not obvious, where they aren't right or wrong, they just generate consequences that are optimal or suboptimal. By the way, in the example of COVID that I just brought up, the suboptimal consequence was everybody stays in the building and everybody gets COVID. The optimal consequence was we take a little disruption now so no one gets COVID. Not right or wrong, just optimal and suboptimal. But every so often, I wouldn't say every so often, many times followers of leaders frame these decisions, particularly afterwards, in terms of right and wrong. And in order for us to think strategically, in order for us to think differently, and to have that go beyond it just being an Apple slogan, well, we've got to challenge that, right? And we have to engage with resistance as a fact rather than as something to be scrubbed away or something to be ignored. All right, so at this point, I'm going to go into the chat function here, and I want to see if anybody shared anything with me. I see a couple of different things here. So yes, domino effect, exactly. Yep, knock-on effects, domino effects, exactly. Yes, Nicole. So, there are domino effects to all of these kinds of things in a supply chain or in a family or in a society. And by the way, here's another thing for leaders to understand. As systems become bigger and more complex, right, as you begin to interconnect them more, the delusion that scale will save you grows bigger. That's why probably the most dangerous organizations at scale are governments. And I'm not talking about individual government departments or individual government employees, some of which we have on the call here today. I'm not talking about that. I am talking about the entire structure of it, because think about how interconnected it is. Think about how centralized it is. This is why fundamentally decentralization and centralization are two of the tension processes that occur inside of societies and cultures. Decentralization, centralization, decentralization, centralization. And when there's too much centralization, a black swan event comes along and decentralizes everything. We can see this in colonialism in the 20th century. We can see this with the internet in the 21st century. During the 18th century, we could see this with the rise of America and the founding of America. And during the 17th century, we saw it with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the British Revolution. Fundamentally, even built into our social structures, it's centralization, decentralization, and domino effects impact all of this. Domino effects impact all of this. All right. Any questions about this so far before I run our first break? All right, cool. So when we think about how do we, navigate these kinds of things, how do we navigate towards the truth of engaging with not just hard things, but how do we navigate towards the truth of, just sort of being in the world? We have to really think about how do we lead. And obviously, we have a platform for that. So our platform is called LeadingKeys. And for those of you who have never seen it before or who haven't really thought about it before, I want to go ahead and share that with you today. Okay, so let's talk about V.U.C.A, right? V.U.C.A is from the U.S. Army War College, and it is an acronym, right? And you can see this in your participant manual. There is a cycle in V.U.C.A, and it really defines behaviors, right? Behaviors towards change and what change is and how we respond to that change. And of course, why do we respond to that change? So as we look at this cycle, as I explain this cycle, I want you to think about a couple of things. How does this show up at your work? How does this show up with your team? How does this show up with the people that you work with? And then of course, how does it show up in your personal life? How does it show up in your leadership style? So the V.U.C.A cycle is defined in a couple of different ways. V stands for volatility. You can write that down. Volatility is about the nature and the dynamics of change and the nature and speed of change. So it's about speed, it's about dynamics, and it's about catalysts for change. You can write that down. So speed, dynamics, and catalysts. What are the catalysts for a change? What are the catalysts for uncertainty? What are the catalysts for complexity? Matter of fact, some of the time, some of those catalysts include size, right? Size can be a catalyst for change, whether it's small or large. But another catalyst for change can be market disruption or an external virus or competitive factors or organizational behavior tendencies or, and I can keep going on and on and on. Even leadership can be a catalyst factor that can create volatility, this V. U stands for uncertainty. Uncertainty means the lack of predictability, the prospects for surprise, and the sense of awareness and understanding of issues and events. So here's the thing about uncertainty. We are all uncertain. If there's anything that COVID has brought home to us, it's how uncertain our lives really are. The presence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the presence of responses to that pandemic, such as lockdowns, mask wearing, social distancing, and on and on and on, that has impacted our teams. Okay, that uncertainty. And by the way, during the early parts of 2020, it seemed as though we were lurching from. I even said this to a couple of professional colleagues. It seemed as though organizations that I was working with and that we were seeing were lurching from one decision to the next decision to the next decision, consistently consistently reactive in an uncertain environment. Well, that's the lack of predictability. Who knows what conversation a governor may have that 10 minutes later is going to turn into an executive order that 20 minutes later is going to turn into that, right? Who knows what kind of platforms are going to be launched in the face of this kind of pandemic, right? Who knows what kind of behaviors we're going to have to adopt in order to be successful moving forward, right? Prospects for surprise. Here's an example. Actually, I won't even use an example. Going back to COVID-19. COVID-19 proved that we can still be surprised. In our sophisticated modern culture, we don't like surprises. We like everything to be predictable. We like everything to be not random. We like everything to be steady and have stasis, right? Well, if things are not random, if things are not predictable, they don't change, right? So unpredictability, surprise really matters. And if we're not surprised, well, then things are certain. So uncertainty means that surprise will exist somewhere inside of there. All right. The C in the V.U.C.A cycle stands for complexity. Complexity means the multiplex of forces. Now, I'm not going to get into Michael Porter and the 5 forces and all this kind of stuff, but what I will say is this. There are a lot of forces that drive change, that drive disruption. Remember I said previously, and Nicole brought up the idea of a domino effect, right? So someone sneezes here, and all of a sudden a hurricane happens there. This is that idea of the butterfly effect, right? A butterfly flaps its wings in India, and a hurricane happens in Texas, right? Well, that's multiplexes of forces. Complexity also covers things like the confounding of issues. You can write that down. A lack of clarity during times of disruption is huge. As a matter of fact, there's something that you can understand as a leader. It's very important to navigate and to understand and to wrap your arms around is this idea. The leader that can think the clearest during a time of disruption can lead their team most effectively. This doesn't mean, by the way, that the leader isn't emotional. It doesn't mean the leader isn't angry or sad or unhappy or going through parts of the grief cycle. What it means is the leader is putting those things aside for the moment and trying to cut through noise to get to clarity. Complexity grows when there is a lack of clarity. And teams win, they beat complexity when they have a leader who has clear and candid thinking. Complexity occurs when there is no cause and effect chain and when there is confusion. So it's not that there's no cause and effect chain. It's that the cause of something, the domino basically, that knocked over your domino is so far away from you, you can't, not only can you not stop it from falling, you can't even believe that it will impact you. This is that idea of no cause and effect chain. There's no way for me to see cause here and effect here and cause here and effect here. I'm blinded by layers of complexity. I'm blinded by layers of occurrence. I'm blinded by layers of events. In the V.U.C.A cycle, volatility, uncertainty, and complexity all mix together, and they dump out in this idea of ambiguity. Ambiguity is the haziness of reality. It includes things like the potential for misreading a situation, thinking that A is B or C is D or E is F. It also leads to the mixed meanings of conditions and not really understanding what's happening here and what's happening there. The most confused leaders, leaders who lack clarity, well, they walk around in ambiguity. And of course, cause and effect confusion, which we already talked about with complexity, but they can double down with ambiguity. When I was teaching and when I was working in higher education, one of the big principal things that we wanted to do was we wanted to train students, future leaders, all future employees, future managers, future supervisors. We wanted to train them. We wanted to encourage them to engage in ambiguity. As a matter of fact, one of the interview questions that we had, one of the sections that we would even evaluate them after they were employees, was on how much of a tolerance for ambiguity did they have? Could they actually tolerate situations where answers weren't easy, where difficulty was going to happen, and where disruption was the coin of the realm? Could they tolerate ambiguity? Many individuals, many leaders struggle with ambiguity, because if there's no wrong answer, but if there's also no right answer, then, well, there's a lot of blame that can go around. There's a lot of blame for failures that can go around. There's a lot of blame for problems that can go around. There's a lot of blame that can go around for a whole bunch of different things. And, if you're working in an organization, if you're leading in a time of disruption, if you're managing a remote team that's going through a disruptive process right now, and you're working in an organization where you have a boss or you have an organizational culture where the avoidance of blame or the consumption of credit is the driving thing for how things happen, is the driving force for how things happen, then when a disruption occurs, like a COVID or a cyber attack or a disruption in your supply chain or a disruption in an information chain, when those kinds of disruptions happen, when there is volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, when the V.U.C.A cycle shows up, you're going to have trouble leading. You're going to have trouble leading because people will be more concerned. The fear of being blamed for making a decision in an ambiguous, complex, uncertain, and volatile environment will be stronger than the fear of the consequences of not making a decision. This is why leaders struggle so much, particularly middle-level leaders who maybe aren't always empowered to make the kinds of decisions that they need to make. So how do we get out of this cycle, right? How do we make sense of volatility and uncertainty? How do we make sense of complexity and ambiguity? How do we make sense of what the U.S. Army War College has given us here with this cycle, which, by the way, occurs over and over again, in which Nicholas Nassim Taleb talks about in relation to black swans, which allows us to be fooled by randomness, which allows a whole bunch of other different things to happen. How do we get out of this cycle? Well, the biggest tip that we can give you today is do not make contingency plans. Instead, think forward. One of the things that you find out if you study enough military history, military strategy, is that generals tend to plan, they tend to fight, they tend to engage with the last war rather than the next one. And now logically you would say, well, yeah, that makes sense, Hassan, because how do you know where the next war is going to come from? You can't possibly do that. Right. You're right. You won't possibly know where the next war is going to come from. You can't possibly know where the next conflict, the next issue, the next terrorist act, you can't possibly know where that's going to happen. So of course they're going to plan from the last one, because you can't know forward. You can't think forward. Actually, yes, you can think forward. You can anticipate issues that are going to shape decision making. So one of the key things that I would write down there is anticipation. You're going to anticipate issues. Anticipating issues means looking at the data you have, and the biggest foil, I would argue, right now that is floating underneath the substrate of our organizations and our cultures is data, but we don't know what to do with it. We have all this data, data. We have people going to school to learn about machine learning and to learn about data gathering and all of this. And we don't make strategic decisions with it because we don't know how to anticipate the issues that are going to be shaped from that data. We don't have the courage to make decisions. And a lot of this is going to be involving courage. So we have to anticipate the issues that are going to shape uncertainty. They're going to shape volatility. They're going to shape complexity. And they're going to shape ambiguity. Number two, we have to understand the consequences of issues and actions. Understand is the second keyword. So anticipate and then understand. Understand is not about acceptance. So I want to be very, very clear. Understand means I get it. Yes, I understand that if we keep printing money, inflation's going to happen. Some of us are on this call today, come from banks and financial institutions. I anticipate this, and so this is going to happen. Yes, I understand. Understanding does not mean agreement. It just means you understand. It's the same thing here. Understanding the consequences of issues. Understanding that, yes, if we do this thing, this suboptimal outcome will happen. If we do this thing, this optimal outcome will happen. Understanding does not mean agreement. People confuse those two together, and leaders don't have the luxury of doing that, particularly in times of disruption and massive change. Number three, appreciate the interdependence of variables. Remember, I was talking about, we're more and more comfortable with the interconnected nature of the world. Well, okay, so appreciate the interdependence of variables. This variable is interdependent upon this variable, which is interdependent upon this variable, and I can't do anything about this variable and this variable. I can only do something about this variable inside of this sphere of influence, but have appreciation for it. Look, where sometimes leaders fall down on teams is they are blind to that appreciation. They actually ignore those other variables because they say, that's outside of my scope. I can't do anything about it, and so I can't do anything about it, and thus I will pretend it doesn't exist. That's a recipe for disaster when a black swan shows up. Or something that could have been predicted, but you didn't because it was outside your sphere of influence. Or to make it even more practical, it wasn't my job. Well, actually, it is your job if you are leading around thinking forward. Number four, prepare for alternative realities and challenges. Preparing for alternative realities doesn't mean making contingency plans. It means saying, okay, here's a loosey-goosey way of how we think about this. And if this thing happens, then we'll do that. And if this thing happens, then we'll do that. And if this thing happens, then we'll do that. When I tell people this, when I walk with teams through this, when I walk with organizations through this, one of the things that I say to them is this: don't make any more than like three kind of sort of, this is what we're going to do if this kind of happens kind of thing. Don't go more than three because you won't remember any more than three. Now, many organizations, many teams are like, well, we do 5 or 10. You're not going to execute on 10 things. This is that now creates complexity out of your contingency plans. You're creating complexity out of something that should be, quite frankly, simple. So instead of doing that, commit to about 3 things, understanding that 2 of them will scare you and 1 of them you'll do. And that's okay. That's what we do. But at least you'll have something to hold on to when something occurs. And lastly, interpret and address relevant opportunities. Inside of each part of the V.U.C.A cycle, inside of volatility, there is opportunity. Inside of uncertainty, there is opportunity. Inside of complexity, there is opportunity. And inside of ambiguity, there is opportunity. I think of the old school industrialist, Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie owned a number of different properties in Pennsylvania. And Andrew Carnegie worked with a lot of people who got wealthy. So did J.P. Morgan, by the way. But a lot of people who wound up getting wealthy right along with him. And I believe it was Carnegie who was asked one time, how do you create all of these millionaires? Which back in the day, millionaire meant you literally had $1 million. Like that was literally the top. That was the billionaires of today, right? And he said something very interesting that's always stuck with me as a quote, a way to understand opportunity. He said, I didn't hire people when they were millionaires. I hired them when they were thousandaires, which back in the day was like 5,000aires. I hired them, or 10,000aires. I hired them when they were thousandaires. He said, you don't go into the mine if you're looking for a diamond. You don't go into the mine looking for the diamond. You go in there anticipating that you'll find it, but you have to move a lot of coal to get to it. You go in there anticipating you'll find it and that you're going to move the coal you got to move. You're going to create the millionaire out of the thousandaire. Or these days, you're going to create the billionaire out of the millionaire. Or you're going to create the millionaire out of the thousandaire. Inside of volatility, there is opportunity. Warren Buffett talks about this a lot in investing. When everybody's buying, you should be selling. And when everybody's selling, you should be buying. Go against the crowd. But this is really hard for leaders to do. Good, and requires courage. Inside of uncertainty, there is opportunity. If everybody's running around and uncertain when a change or a disruption occurs, and you are clear, you are consistent, and you are committed, and you are riding the wave of uncertainty, calmly making decisions from moment to moment, but never moving off of your true north, that's an opportunity. There's opportunity in complexity. Here's where the opportunity exists. If everybody's worried about and hiding in complexity as a change occurs, well, we can't make this decision because, this will happen and this will happen and this will happen, and they're giving all the dominoes and they're increasing the complexity. And if with every single sentence, the person who can lead a team out of that cycle of complexity, who can find the gold, find the diamond inside of that coal mine of complexity, the person who can do that is the person who says, let's forget all that. What's the one thing we have to do now? And do that. Now, there's also complexity. There's also gold in building complexity. This is the opposite of the V.U.C.A piece, in a more of a negative fashion, I guess, or a dark side of V.U.C.A, is this. As complexity builds, it gives people more opportunities to hide and engage in machinations that they wouldn't normally engage in. I think of the quote from Game of Thrones that I love from Peter Baelish: chaos is both a pit and a ladder. Leaders would do well to keep that in mind. Finally, ambiguity. There's gold in ambiguity. If the situation is uncertain, right? If nobody wants to understand reality, or if the potential for misreads is really there, if there are mixed meanings, well, sometimes mixed meanings can help us. Sometimes we can play the ends against the middle. Now, again, if you're ethical, you may not want to do that. Your ethical mileage may vary. But at the same time, there is an opportunity there inside of ambiguity. Leaders have to figure out where that is. And the only way to do that is with clear thinking. How do you clearly exploit those opportunities? How do you interpret and address relevant opportunities? Let me run those down again. Don't make contingency plans. Think forward rather than backward. Here's how you think forward. You anticipate issues. You understand consequences. You appreciate the interdependence of variables. You prepare for alternative realities. Not contingency plan, you prepare. 3 things and then you're done. And then you interpret and address whatever the opportunities may be. And you don't operate out of a spirit of fear. You operate out of a spirit of confidence and hope and success for your team. That's what thinking forward does. Finally, in order to combat the V.U.C.A cycle, you have to understand that anti-fragility is the way forward. Anti-fragility is the way. It is the key. When you build teams that are anti-fragile, you build teams that are small. You build teams that can take a hit and respond rather than react. Teams that can be pushed down and then move forward. They are the bamboo, not the brick. When a storm comes through, a mighty oak gets ripped out of the ground and thrown miles and miles away, but bamboo waves back and forth. If this seems very Eastern, well, it's because it slightly is. And anti-fragility is the thing that probably leaders should be pursuing. But they can't get there until they understand the mindset of their teams. They understand the value of how their teams are engaging, and they understand why their teams are going to pick the things potentially that they are going to pick. All right. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to show you something um, that I think will help you. And, it's a product that we've developed, and we are very excited and very encouraged by the kinds of products that we've developed here at Human Services Consulting and Training in the space of and in the face of uncertainty, in the space and in the face of COVID-19, in the space and in the face of massive volatility, massive uncertainty, massive change. We were able to pivot and begin to provide products and services to our organization, or not organization, to other organizations that allowed them to navigate the V.U.C.A cycle immediately. And so I want to show you, well, just what a couple of those processes, what a couple of those projects, a couple of those things really look like. So please take a look at this.
Time of COVID-19, social distancing, and remote work, how are you going to upskill your managers and supervisors? In a time of workplace disruption, declining training budgets, and diminishing bandwidth, how are you going to maintain your team's tactical edge over the competition? We know you're exhausted from webinars that don't work, Zoom meetings that are just about talking heads, and we know you don't want to download another white paper on leadership for your team that they won't even bother to read. HSCT has a solution with our customized remote training solutions. Here's how it works. 1, you tell us what you need for your team. From change management to performance reviews, we've trained folks on it all. Number 2, we work with you to determine budget, length, and delivery platform. Number 3, our remote facilitators interactively deliver your content tailored to your team's leadership development needs live. Number 4, we record your training, turn around your recording, and get it back to you within 4 to 6 weeks. And that's it. Your team is trained, your team is energized, and your team is ready to engage with this new world we're all living in with leadership skills that last a lifetime. HSCT's customized remote training solutions feature a tiered pricing structure that fits your organizational budget. Leadership topics customized for your deep organizational needs. Qualified remote trainers with a combined 20 plus years of training experience. Our customized remote training solutions can be delivered via Zoom, Cisco WebEx, GoToMeeting, or Skype, and can be combined with personalized coaching calls so you know they are implemented and you know the insights work. Get in touch with us today to schedule a conversation so we can walk you through our process. Check out our website at www.hsconsultingandtraining.com for a list of our webinar topics, or give us a call at 1-833-216-8296, or email us at info@hsconsultingandtraining.com, and we'll get back to you to begin a conversation today. Here at HSCT, we innovate on people.
Look, remote training is the future, right? It's where we're going to go. And one of the things that's really interesting about delivering training remotely is that we can do webinars like this, and they can be really high quality, and they can be really engaging, and they can be really customized for 30 to, in some cases, 300 people. We've already started working with clients in this space to deliver remote training, and we look forward to working with your organization and your culture to deliver training as well. So yeah, please get in contact with us and let us know how we can help you make your leaders better today. All right, so let's move into the downhill end of our webinar today. How do you identify how a team can navigate complexity? How do you identify how a team can navigate this concept of V.U.C.A, right? How do you figure out how your team can respond or will respond, or how do you predict how your team will respond to something like black swans, the presence of black swans, the reality of black swans? How do you do that? Well, here's how you do this. You identify your team's zero. This is a concept from a guy named Peter Thiel, and he's a venture capitalist and investor out of Silicon Valley, and he talks a lot about sort of this idea that we don't really think too much about innovation, and we don't really think too much about how innovation occurs. And the reason why we don't and the reason why we accept it is because there are certain organizations that begin with certain mindsets that are just different. So the example that I always give is Google and Yahoo, right? On the surface, they look like the same company. On the surface, they're both internet search engine providers. Except Yahoo got sold off for parts and Google is now worth, well, Google's now the most valuable company ever created. How did that happen? Well, Thiel would say that happened, yeah, partially because of the products that they've developed, and yeah, partially because everybody uses them, and yeah, partially because they invested well. But he said the big thing is they understood their zero, and Yahoo did not. They understood at an intimate level and built into all of their products, services, approaches, marketing, sales, finance, hiring, firing. They understood precisely what made them different, and they executed on it in non-obvious ways. That is identifying your team's zero. One of the key ways to do this is to realize that innovation and change, disruption, if we want to put it that way, but let's talk about the more positive sort of version of this. Innovation and change happen from mindsets first and actions second. So your brain has to be right before an innovation can really occur. We see this all of the time, and I used to, when I had an office, my office was down the road from IBM. And if you are watching this in a national context or even an international context, I can tell you that IBM in the city of Endicott, New York, does not look like what you imagine it to look like. It looks like a burned down industrial hulk. IBM no longer is headquartered in Endicott, New York. And the story of IBM is told in organizational behavior classes. It's told in organizational behavior case studies. It's repeated over and over as an example of how leaders can accept change. And by the way, it's told as an example, it's used as an example of how leaders can enforce change on an organization that does not want it or doesn't think they need it. By the way, IBM came late to two of the three biggest innovations. And by the way, came late doesn't mean they didn't know it, but two of the three biggest innovations in the latter half of the 20th century. So they came late to personal computers, infamously asking, Bill Gates, who was really going to want a personal computer in their home? Then they came late to the idea of hardware that would be in your home. They ignored Apple until it was too late. And then they almost came late. This is the third one. They almost came late to the internet. But by that point, IBM had already shifted and had begun to accept that change was occurring. By the way, if they'd missed the internet, there would be no IBM at all anywhere. And the leaders who enforced change upon IBM, which by the way hurt. If you don't believe me, just show up at Endicott. Actually, you can Google pictures of Endicott, New York. You can see how the hurt was put in Endicott, New York, the corporate home of IBM for almost 100 years. Accepting change will have consequences. Enforcing change will have consequences. In order to identify a team's zero, leaders have to accept that change begins up here before it manifests out here. And if you can't change the teams up here, then we have to begin to make some hard decisions the way that IBM did, because then you can't get to a zero. You have to bring people in who can develop a zero, who can develop a new way of thinking, rather than trying to compete in the same old ways, using the same old thinking and getting the same old outcomes. This is one of the ways that you will be able to successfully navigate V.U.C.A and black swan events that appear to be random. Number two, leaders need to engage with intentionality. They need to be tactical and intentional in determining what their teams and organizations can do better than any other competitors. Every team, every organization can do something better, can execute in a better way on something than their competitor can. They just have to figure out what it is. So for instance, at Human Services Consulting and Training, our zero is we're small. That's our zero. It's no more complicated than that. We're small. We're small. We hire intentionally. We hire slowly. We tend to not fire quickly. We build our culture in spite of XYZ maybe not happening immediately, or in spite of ABC taking a long time. We develop people because we're asking organizations to develop their people, so we develop our people. But we're small. Because what I decided as the CEO and founder was that the number of people that I wanted to lead had to have a cap, had to have a top. And so I thought about it for many years. What is this cap going to be? Is it going to be 500 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people? Is it going to be 1 million? Is it going to be 100,000? Do I want to be a CEO of a big public company? Do I want to be the CEO of a small private company? Do I want those kinds of experiences? Do I want to be that kind of leader? And by the way, since this organization is being built by individuals, we can decide what we want to be. We can engage intentionally. We have a small team. That's our zero. Which means when an event that we could not have anticipated, not COVID, by the way, but the executive shutdown orders that go along with COVID, when those orders happen, we can go remote in 2 days. Does that mean that everything's going to work out? No, but it means like we can go remote in 2 days because we're small and we trust each other. Size and trust, that's a zero. That means that our competitors, like a Dale Carnegie or a Binghamton University, which is our local university, or a Salesforce, it takes them a lot longer to turn their boat. And by the way, it takes them a lot longer to turn their boat. We're already on top of them as a small company. That's where small, as a matter of size, anti-fragile as a matter of size, allows us to flex and move in ways that if we were bigger, if we were brick building, or if we were a mighty oak, would be really hard. So engage with intentionality. Leaders have to understand that in order to understand a team's zero. And then finally, leaders can engage with undermining their own personal resistance and practice looking at the world clearly. Look, the number one place where resistance lies in all organizations, all teams, and all cultures around V.U.C.A, around black swans, around random change, around disruption, even on remote teams. The number one place where resistance lies is in the leader. I don't want to do that. That makes me really uncomfortable. Well, if we do that, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do this. And then all of a sudden I get caught in a web of my own, well, this and this and this and this planning. How do I know this? Because I know about my own personal resistance. I have resistance the same way that anybody else does. I'm not saying here anything to you that I haven't said to myself. Finding a team's zero means undermining your own personal resistance as a leader. It means being clear and candid about what are the things that are pulling you back. What are the things that are preventing you from leading the team effectively? What are the things that are preventing you from helping the team find their zero and executing on it in a way that really matters? What are the things you need to put in your toolbox? What are the things that you need to improve upon? What are the things that you need to engage around? What are the things that maybe you need to get rid of? What are some of the things that once you get rid of them, it might be kind of scary to get rid of them, right? What are the things maybe that you need help on? Undermining your own resistance as a leader really hurts. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not a pleasant thing to have to do on a regular basis. And as a matter of fact, I've struggled myself with figuring out, just exactly how do I undermine my own personal resistance? Where is that resistance coming from? And it's not about doing a psychological evaluation on myself, but it's really looking at what happens when volatility comes in. How do I respond to that? What happens when there's times of complexity? How do I engage with that? When interconnectedness becomes more of a thing and when ambiguity really starts to raise its ugly head, how do I deal with that? Because I signal as a leader, I signal to the team what the response is going to be, or in some cases, what the reaction is going to be. Um, Leadership is huge in this, and sometimes, look, as I've said before, sometimes you need more. Sometimes you need more help. Sometimes you need more support. And we here at Human Services Consulting and Training exist to be able to do that. And we've developed our Leadership Toolbox Masterclass in order to be able to help you do that. So take a gander at this, and I'll be back in just a second.
You need more interaction, more depth, more enlightenment. To develop as a leader, you need more insight than a book or a podcast episode can deliver, more high touch than a webinar or a virtual event can deliver, and just, quite frankly, more. To give you more, I'm launching the HSCT Leadership Toolbox Masterclass. Based on my 7+ years of delivering live in-person leadership training experiences to supervisors, managers, and executives, and based in a practical history of training 15,000 plus people, I developed the HSCT Leadership Toolbox Masterclass to bring you what I've learned over my years of leadership development. The HSCT Leadership Toolbox Masterclass is designed with you in mind. It features 12 live leadership development webinars delivered over the course of 2 hours, 2 times per month for 6 months, covering the following leadership topic areas: conflict management, dealing with difficult people, boosting team morale, adapting to change, and managing the multi-generational workforce, and much, much more. 12+ guides, handouts, and toolkits designed to help you get better long after the masterclass has closed and ended. 4 personal leadership coaching Zoom calls for 90 minutes per month, where you get to pick my brain directly and ask me the most difficult questions that you really couldn't ask in the actual masterclass itself. And finally, 2 free tickets to my virtual January 2021 Leadership Retreat event. We're very excited. We're putting this together. It'll give you an opportunity to interact with other leaders, to discuss insights, and to gain deeper wisdom. This is an over $3,000 value, and I'm giving it to you today for only $497 per person. This is unbelievable. I would never discount something this low. But in a time of COVID-19, in a time of virtual transition, and in a time of remote work, I know that you need to be a better leader, and I want to walk along with you, walk alongside you to make you a better leader with no fluff, no waste of your time, and nothing that isn't practical, tactical, and applicable to your team, your organization, and your leadership approach right now. Get in touch with me today to schedule a conversation so I can walk you through the process and sign you up for the HSCT Leadership Toolbox Masterclass. Check out our website at www.hsconsultingandtraining.com/leadership toolbox for a list of our leadership masterclass topics, or give me a call at 1-833-216-8296, or email me directly at jsorrells, SORRELLS, at hsconsultingandtraining.com, and I'll get back to you to start our conversation. I built HSCT to innovate on people. Let's help you innovate on people as a leader now.
All right. Very proud of the Leadership Masterclass. That was an interesting process, an interesting product to come up with and to develop. It's taken us a while to really figure out how to position it and how to make it really useful for someone like yourself in a leadership position. Yes, we're good. We're putting together a virtual leadership summit for January. We're kind of and try to start figuring out how to put that together. And we would love to be able to have you there so that you can meet other leaders who have also taken advantage of the Leadership Toolbox Masterclass. $497 is an amazing price. I would even pay that. This is a lot of content. It is over $3,000 value, and we have deeply discounted it. Yes, because we are in a time of COVID, but also because, well, quite frankly, market situations and market fluctuations have changed. And so how much personal development do you want to engage in? How much personal coaching do you really need? And how valuable are relationships to you right now? And how valuable will they be as times of uncertainty continue to spill out? All right. So we're sort of in our close here. Let's talk a little bit about, because we talked about how we can identify a zero, right? And we talked about V.U.C.A, right? And I want to make a couple of different statements here about black swans. I want to talk about that. And I want to ask a question actually here before I do that. Before I talk really about black swans, I want to put a question here in the chat. And Nicole has put something up here, which I'm going to reference here in just a second. And we'll talk about planning. But of this idea, and it's in your handout too, that, there are some steps that we can take. And this isn't a silver bullet. That's not what I sell. I don't sell silver bullets, and I don't sell magic wands, because we don't live in the world of Harry Potter. We don't live in the world of magic, right? We live in the world of reality. And in the world of reality, I have a question for you. What's your process? How do you identify your team's zero? How do you identify that one thing that they can do that makes them better than any competitor, right? Makes them better even than volatility, makes them better than uncertainty, makes them better than complexity, makes them rise to ambiguity. How do you identify your team's zero? How indeed do you plan for the worst? I mean, yeah, expect for the best, but plan for the worst. How do you do that in a way that's optimistic? How do you do that in a way that's uplifting? How do you do that in a way that creates the kind of culture that you want to see inside of a team, and actually not just hooks onto a culture, but supports a culture and grows it from the inside, so that when an event that you could not have anticipated does happen, you're ready for it. Black swan events are really interesting. Again, I've mentioned this several times, and so I wanted to define this more specifically at this point. Black swan events were just defined by a writer named Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He's a quants trader, finance trader, derivatives trader, written a number of different books. His latest book is Fooled by Randomness. Working my way through that book right now. When I read his books, I actually get a headache, and normally I don't get headaches from books. I tend to think of myself as kind of an okay guy, mentally speaking, kind of be able to wrap my brain around some intellectual stuff. I kind of do okay with that. But even he challenges me, right? Because he brings a lot of ideas, a lot of complexity, particularly mathematical-based complexity, to concepts and to synthesizing understanding of systems. And so it's worthwhile to read Taleb, particularly when he speaks on this issue of black swans. So he says that black swans have three really huge things in common. He said the first thing that they have in common is that they are predictable in hindsight. So after they occur, we believe that there was no other way for that thing to occur than the way that it occurred. But if we really believed that, then we would have done something about it before it happened. Like, there's going to be a lot of hindsight starting next year in 2021. There's going to be a lot of blame gaming going on in hindsight. And it's already started actually in some corners around COVID and around responses to COVID. But if we know what we known beforehand, right, hindsight bias. Number two, he said that the second thing that all black swans have in common is they are highly probable. Not predictable, but probable. So it is probable that there would be a pandemic that would come along. It's probable. Not predictable, couldn't know which specific one, but it's probable, because probability means that a thing is more likely to happen rather than less likely to happen. Probability is huge, particularly when you're thinking about where to put money in risk, right? Or where to put money in the stock market, or where to put money, well, in your finances. This is more probably going to happen than this thing. Derivatives traders and hedge fund managers tend to, and that's why they're called hedge funds, they tend to hedge their bets, right? This is more likely or less likely to occur. I'm going to put my money here, I'm going to put my money there. Black swan events are highly probable. They are usually explained in hindsight. And they have massive impact. That's the third thing he said. They have massive impact. So a black swan event for an individual is a divorce when you thought everything was going right in your marriage. A black swan event is what happens to the turkey on Thanksgiving. This is the example I always bring up. So for the turkey, the last Thursday in November is a black swan event. Gobble, gobble, gobble. Bob was eating. Gobble, gobble, gobble. Gosh, Bob got a lot of feed. Gobble, gobble, gobble. Now Bob's on your table. And if you're a vegetarian, I'm sorry. If you're a vegan, I'm sorry. You don't do any of that. I apologize. My vegan, vegetarian friends, I know you're not eating the turkey. But for those who are, for those turkeys, the last Thursday in November every year is a black swan event. They're surprised every year. The turkeys are. That showing up on your table has a massive impact on them. Here's an event that would be defined as a black swan event. September 11th was a black swan event. It had massive impact. 20 years later, we're still taking off our shoes to get on planes. Massive impact means literally what it says. Massive. Impacting multiple different sectors of an economy, of a financial system, of a health system. So you can argue that COVID-19 meets at least two of the criteria for a black swan event, and it kind of wanders along the edge of that third criteria. So it was highly probable that there was going to be a pandemic. We were being warned about this, and the risk factors were being factored in as soon as 2 years ago. Okay? And by the way, we'd experienced pandemics before. So we'd experienced SARS, we'd experienced West Nile virus. Anybody remember that? Zika, right? We've experienced those things globally. AIDS, like we've experienced those kinds of things before. So probable, highly probable. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it would have massive impact. That one will be argued about. That's the kind of a little bit. We're already seeing this pop up, right? In the examples of Sweden versus the rest of the world with lockdowns and social distancing. We're going to have discussions about that. And again, I'm not coming down on one side or the other. I'm just talking, saying on that area of massive impact, that one's where it's a little fragile as a black swan event. Matter of fact, I believe that Tala was interviewed recently, a few months before this recording, and he said, no, it doesn't. COVID-19 actually isn't a black swan. And I think he went into a whole explanation for why. And I think that massive impact one is kind of the one that he's a little bit loosey-goosey on. But then the other one is that it's explained in hindsight. Definitely. We are going to explain this in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and on in hindsight. Absolutely. It meets that criteria. So that is a black swan event. And what Nassim Taleb said was this. If you want to overcome a black swan event, an event that has massive impact, an event that's highly probable, like the probability of it happening is higher than the probability of it not happening, and that will be explained in hindsight, what you have to do is develop anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is this idea of doing the opposite things that most people would normally do. So he said that there are three kinds of organizations, three kinds of teams, three mindsets in the world. He said, really, all starts from up here, just like Peter Thiel did with the zero idea. So the first thing is that we have a robust mindset. We think that our families are secure, our finances are secure, our relationships are secure. And in reality, he said there's robustness, but he said robustness is usually a lie. He said most of our stuff is actually really fragile. We've seen some of this exposure with, again, the pandemic, to go back to this. We've seen families, relationships, as people were in lockdown and stay-at-home orders. We've seen a rise in domestic violence, drug use, alcohol use, child abuse, all these kinds of things, right? We've seen a reduction in people going to the hospital for things like heart attacks and cancer, right? Because they thought the hospitals were going to be overwhelmed. That's That's an example of what we're talking about here. That's an example of fragility. The reason why we were told to flatten the curve was because our hospital systems are fragile and couldn't bear the weight. But wait, I thought they were robust. This tension between robustness and fragility is where Nassim Taleb then puts anti-fragile. And he says organizations and teams need to focus on being anti-fragile. They need to focus on not deluding themselves that they are robust, but also not becoming so interconnected at scale that when something happens, their fragility will be exposed. So, key steps to developing an anti-fragile team. Step number 1, evaluate the team first by how they succeed and fail at integrating, here's the thing, integrating the emotional content of a change. Remember, I said, when you're developing responses to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, when you're trapped in a V.U.C.A cycle, the thing that you want to look at is people's mindsets. What are they thinking? How are they thinking? What's going on up here? What are their emotions like? Evaluate the team. This is the first thing the leader has to do in a cool and calculating fashion. Evaluate how they succeed and fail at integrating the emotional content of a change. So if a person takes a change on your team and collapses totally, you want to integrate that evaluation. You want to think about that. If another person, however, rises to the occasion and all of a sudden finds all these things to do and all these opportunities and is coming and talking to you about opportunities and is really excited, you're going to want to evaluate that too. Evaluate the team. That will tell you whether or not your team is robust, fragile, or has the capability of being anti-fragile. Number 2, create opportunities for stress testing the response and reactions of a team to change. You're going to want to stress test your team. I was just talking about this with my team before I came on this webinar. And as weird as it may sound, it's not weird anymore. Every team should probably figure out how to do the opposite thing that is their dominant thing. Because when you do more of your dominant thing, you get stronger and stronger at it. It's just like when you write with your hand, whichever hand you're dominant with, you do more and more of it and you get better and better at it. And your hand, which is non-dominant, well, it gets less and less good at it, which is why, here's a simple experiment. If you're left-handed, switch to your right hand. And if you're right-handed, switch to your left hand and then try to sign your name. Now, in previous years, when I would run this or ask people to do this, left-handed people would write really well with their right hand because in school, up to probably about 4 generations ago, probably a little bit sooner than that, a little bit less than that, 3 generations ago, people who were left-handed were forced to write with their non-dominant hand. Now, not so much. Interesting. Explore the opportunities, create the opportunities to see the team react. This will require you probably as a leader to upset apple carts. I'm just going to say that right out loud. But there's no better time to do that than right now because massive apple carts have been upset everywhere. And so opportunities, remember I said there's opportunities in uncertainty, there's opportunities in complexity, there's opportunities in volatility, there's opportunities in ambiguity. Right now might be the time to begin to create those opportunities to stress test the team so that they can become better at writing with their non-dominant hand. More anti-fragile. Number 3, avoid being fooled. Avoid being fooled by randomness. Look for patterns in behavior, no matter how seemingly tenuous. Look for patterns. This thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing. And if it keeps going in this kind of way, boom. Okay, more likely than not, it'll wind up there. The probability is high that if we avoid looking at what things are that seem random, if we avoid that, we avoid being fooled into being fearful. And that's really what this is about. Avoid being fooled. Avoid falling into the trap of fear of randomness. All right, last couple of steps to developing an anti-fragile team. Step number 4, encourage the development of a zero mindset and an approach to change. Remember, I asked you, what's your team zero? What is the thing that no matter what else happens, we can fall back on this thing? This is our Alamo. This is our fallback position. If you've never done that before and you believe that your team is robust and something comes along and really exposes it as being fragile, the team will collapse. We see this happening, by the way, quite a bit in small and medium-sized businesses right now. When I drive down the street of my town, I see a lot of shuttered shops. Part of that is because of COVID, but part of it's also because there has been consistent change in my community over the last 25, 30 years where leaders did not encourage the development of a zero mindset. Instead, they believed they were robust and that things would go along as they had always gone along. And then when a change came along, when a predominant provider of opportunity in a community left, well, those businesses couldn't deal with that, and they actually were exposed as being fragile rather than anti-fragile. They couldn't shift, and so they collapsed. By the way, this happens all the time. I'm not arguing for I'm not arguing, I'm not committing to this idea of just having teams around for a team's sake. Sometimes a team has to go away. Sometimes a team has to dissolve in order to come back as something bigger. Sometimes that has to happen, but the leader's responsibility is to encourage the development of a zero mindset. So when that happens and the team comes back together, we have something to build on. We have a basis to build on rather than building on shifting sand. Finally, step number 5, expect resistance and plan for how to handle it. Expect resistance. If you're not expecting resistance, I don't know what you're doing as a leader. If you're not expecting resistance to conflict, if you're not expecting resistance to incivility, if you're not even expecting resistance to this idea of developing an anti-fragile team, if you're not expecting resistance, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know how you're engaging. Resistance, again, is built into all of our systems. It's built into everything, right? It's built into our bodies, it's built into our biology. We were designed to resist because, well, resistance allows us to create stasis, which allows us to create safety, which allows us to create, well, stability. And in order to evolve, you need a certain amount of stability. So there's nothing wrong with resistance. However, in times where things are moving faster than your ability to evolve, well, you've got to adapt faster. Got to move quicker, got to anticipate resistance, not run away from it, not encourage it, but anticipate it and have a plan for how to address it and respond to it. All right. So that's the close of our webinar today. I would encourage you to check out LeadingKeys for your middle level managers and supervisors. That's that pre-recorded content. It can begin the process of thinking about these complex issues in a broad spectrum, in a much broader way. I would encourage you to take advantage of our remote training and our customized training from Human Services Consulting and Training. We work, like I said, we can work with teams as small as 10, 15, 20, 30, all the way up to 300, right? Webinars customized with your content and delivered by our remote trainers with 20 plus years of collected experience. Will be a dynamic and a highly interactive engagement. And finally, if you'd like to get a little more me, if you'd like to really connect with me, if you'd like to really figure out how to adapt to change and ask me really the hard, sticky questions that you can't really ask on a webinar like this, or you can't maybe ask in a remote training where it's very specific, or maybe you're looking at stuff that's on LeadingKeys and content on LeadingKeys, you're like, well, that's really interesting, but I'm beyond that. Well, then that's where the Leadership Toolbox Masterclass really kicks in. And so I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and think about all 3 of these products for yourself, your team, and your organization today. Because, of course, we here innovate on people. Thank you once again for attending our webinar today. I appreciate it. On my close here, are there any questions that anybody has for me today about anything I've talked about with either V.U.C.A or black swans or being fooled by randomness, or even the idea of building an anti-fragile team? Does anybody have any questions for me? All right, great. So again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you attending today. This is the end of our Taming the Virtual Beast webinar series. We will, of course, be producing all of these webinars and putting them on our website. And so you can check that out at www.hsconsultingandtraining.com underneath our resources tab. We will have recorded webinars underneath our resources tab coming up here in the next few weeks, and you'll be able to go back and take a look at this content and share it with folks that you know, share it with people who you know would be able to take advantage of it, and of course, be able to look around at all of our other products and services that we offer through Human Services Consulting and Training. Once again, my name is Hassan Sorrells. I am the CEO of Human Services Consulting and Training. I want to thank you for, once again, your time, your attention, for taking notes, and for participating today. I want to thank you for engaging with me. I get my energy from all of you, and so I appreciate that. And I want you to go out and have a good rest of your day, and I want you to do something with this information. Thank you.